Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the LGB Alliance USA podcast. Today, we are here with the unyielding bicyclist. She is the lesbian lawyer behind the BadFacts Substack, which offers a critical look at so-called gender-affirming care. Examples of her articles include How FTMs Hijacked Gay Activism, Parts 1 and 2, the ACLU's Original Sin, and Blast Off, The Meteoric Rise of Trans, 1994 to 1997. If any of that sounds interesting to you, make sure to check out her Substack and listen to the rest of this interview. Let's begin by asking the unyielding bicyclist herself, why did you decide to get involved in this contentious debate about gender ideology?
Well, I just became obsessed with it kind of gradually over the years, I would say. I don't have any dramatic real life story, which is I'm thankful for. I was reading more and more about it. I was concerned about the impacts of this movement on free speech and on young lesbians. And so I was kind of like more and more getting angry about it online. And then I realized that there was all this legal action happening that was not really being reported on, especially in the mainstream media. There'd just be these headlines about some awesome litigation victory by the ACLU, and it would be like super shallow coverage. And I could learn so much more just spending a few minutes reading like what had been filed in court, for example. And so I started, writing on Substack for different people and just trying to like get involved that way and get some real information out there about the law.
Interesting. So you were never a supporter of gender ideology to begin with?
I mean, I think I was passively polite about it. And I remember I always felt kind of suspicious or not in alignment with some things, just like, I knew that there was a problem for feminism to be saying that somebody has an essence that is female, even though their body is male. And so I didn't love that, but I also like it wasn't rubbed in my face very much. So I was working on other issues and I would see that and be like, oh, that's weird. I would hear like rumors about things going down in that world of activism. And I would think, well, I'm not going to work on that cause. But I'm not somebody who had to do like a big conversion. But I mean, it's not like I knew what was going on either. I wasn't that smart, but I just wasn't involved either.
So you would say that you kind of got into it from the perspective of being a lawyer and being curious about these court cases, right?
That's how I like kind of escalated into speaking to people and writing online and talking more about it to my friends, was that point where I was like, oh, there's really something missing in terms of legal commentary and just understanding and explaining the law to people.
And I found that to be true. And your coverage of the legal stuff has been really, really helpful in understanding this because it gets really confusing. I think most people are confused by it, which is why no one bothers looking into it.
Yeah, thank you. No, I definitely feel that it is like genuinely confusing stuff, but and the media, of course, is making it worse.
The main thing we want to talk about today is the misconception that the trans stuff just happened into the LGBT community after gay marriage was won. People seem to think that's when it took off. And you've written several articles that kind of show that that's not quite the case. You want to tell us a little bit about why and how you started the research and then what you've found out?
Yeah, absolutely. This is such an important topic. And I love to talk about it because there is this idea, which you see on the internet, you see like among our people, where they're saying, oh, it's a cynical take, or a little bit cynical at least, that says, well, the gay rights movement, once it was won in 2015 with gay marriage, with Obergefell and the Supreme Court, then all those people need to keep their jobs. And so what they did was, instead of like just quitting and going into a different area of law, what they did was they kind of made up this issue of trans rights, or maybe they discovered it. But that's actually, no, it didn't start in 2015. You just first noticed it in 2015 is what I would say to a lot of people. And so I started looking into this. I mean, like I said, I started my research in the legal area, but I became so curious about where it came from as I did that. So that took me into the past, and the whole history of all this is fascinating and wonderful. So one of the first questions I had, and one that I keep coming back to, is like, when did this gay trans collision happen? And what was the relationship like before it happened? And all of this. So it's one of my favorite topics. And so I can say that these two groups were kind of moving in tandem, like from beginning in the 60s, 70s, as two separate movements. There was some antagonism between them, but they were also intersecting because they had this overlap of like, basically they didn't have a lot of options for where to hang out, either group. Like bars didn't want to have gay people in their bars, that they didn't want to have men dressed as women in their bars. And so the two groups would end up kind of socializing and running into each other in, for example, Greenwich Village in Manhattan. But they were not natural allies. Among the trans people, a lot of their organizations were based around what you might call cross-dressing or transvestitism, which was the men who were dressing as women to become aroused, all that stuff we love to talk about. So those guys were a big part of the trans scene, and that includes medicalizing, but it also includes guys who were maybe early on in their journey and were just cross-dressing for, we can call it, fun. They were controlling a lot of the trans scene, and they thought of themselves as respectable heterosexual men. And so they would have like no gays policies, and they would make a big deal about how none of their members were into dudes. So openly hostile to the gay rights movement. And I'm talking like, the 1970s here is once they started to kind of organize. So at the same time, you have the gay rights movement, which is defining itself as being opposed to doctors, because for decades, of course, the medical establishment had been telling gay people that there was something wrong with them and they needed to be treated with, sometimes horrible things like electroshock, aversion therapy. And so part of what was called gay liberation in the 1960s was all about throwing off the medical establishment, getting rid of it, moving on and saying what we are is natural. And so the men and women who were involved in this movement naturally looked at transsexualism, and they also saw gay people themselves transitioning, and they were opposed. And they saw what we see today, which is that there's like an ideological problem here, saying that people need to transition because they are gender nonconforming. So, back then you had these two groups, which are, maybe they're hanging out with each other sometimes, but they're generally not the same. They're not aligned in terms of their ideologies. And there's some overlap because some gay people are transitioning, but they're ideologically not aligned.
Would it be fair to say that they were hanging out generally in the same bars? Because, for example, gay men have cross-dressed. Well, I guess all homosexuals have cross-dressed for a very long time. And did it make sense for the transvestites or the heterosexual men who are doing this to go to those spaces because they could get away with their cross-dressing there?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think that they might have been seeking that out, and so kind of they're ending up together. And then our favorite strand in this is the straight guys cross-dressing who are just harassing lesbians. So they're entering gay spaces, particularly lesbian spaces, because they want to harass and have sex with the women, and they're calling themselves lesbians. So of course that's where they fit in.
And this was happening a long time ago. Some people think this is a very new phenomenon, and me and you have both done some research into this, but I know you've talked about it in some of your articles, and it starts all the way back in the 60s even. If there was, or probably even sooner, if there was a women's group, a lesbian group or a lesbian club or a lesbian bar, these guys were trying to show up. These guys were trying to get in.
Yeah, that's right. They figured out this whole strategy very early on. It came naturally to them.
Although at the time, I've heard some older lesbians I've talked to who were around in the 70s. They talked about it like the lesbians just kind of tolerated them in general if it was like a bar or a club, and just they were kind of like a joke. And I don't know. I find that concerning a little bit, because I'm like, they probably just didn't understand the full scope of these guys, maybe.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've read all sorts of accounts from that era. It sounds like there was a big range of responses, but even the most with it women were not alert to the fetishism. Like the doctors, even though the doctors knew this, the gender doctors, but they were hiding it and disavowing it. And all these people didn't have the internet like we do, so it just seems like that knowledge, even among people who were very skeptical, was slow to take hold.
Some of the radical feminists knew it, though.
I think so, yeah. But even
well,
then,
at least eventually.
Yeah, eventually.
Well, one story I've heard too is that lesbians did sort of blow off quite a few of the sort of fetishy trans people who were trying to enter their community, and that it wasn't really until sometime in the late 90s then you started getting mass numbers of lesbians taking these people seriously and actually like welcoming them in. So I thought that was an interesting narrative about why it is that suddenly there were a lot of people who actually started, like lesbians who actually started buying into it.
Yeah, that is interesting. And I think that's because there was so much pressure. There were at least a few people in the 1970s who were at least okay or accommodating. So I've written a little bit. I think we might have seen that Dyke magazine spread from the 1970s. And so the people writing that were very much on top of it and concerned, but they were also complaining a lot about their friends who were not with them and who were saying, oh, it's fine. Like, I just feel bad for these guys. So, and maybe those women weren't as vocal back then, but they were around. And then there's a law professor I wrote about who kind of published a sympathetic article in 1979. So, so the pressure tactics were starting to work back then, but yeah, over the years, I think it became more institutionally favored among lesbians and also less controversial, or less people like us were driven underground.
Was that the lawyer you're talking about, what was her name, Mary Dunlap or something?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. Yeah, and I liked that article because I think it dispelled some misconceptions people had about the role that feminism played in a lot of this. You know, some people I've heard some people, mostly critics of feminism, trying to really blame feminism for enabling this. And I think you showed it was kind of a marginal thing. You know, you had this one lawyer who was pushing for it, but that wasn't really the biggest reason why this gender ideology thing caught on.
Yeah, exactly. And the feminists were not powerful enough to kind of overthrow reality so extremely. And they, they might have been interested in this and like just because they wanted to be nice or whatever, but they did not have the power.
You know what else I like to debunk is this idea that that women were all on the same page in the 70s or in the 80s. They weren't. Like, from the beginning, feminists and lesbian feminists were kind of split
Yeah, exactly.
around whether to allow men who claim to be women into their spaces.
Yeah, exactly. There was entire time people on all sides. And another example from the early 80s is Anise Parker. So she's a woman who she goes on to be mayor of Houston. So she's like, the most powerful lesbian in America, maybe 10 years ago. Houston being like the fourth biggest city. And back in the early 80s, she was organizing with Phyllis Fry, who's a man, cross-dressing man. That's very welcoming toward him, invites him onto her lesbian softball team.
That's right. I read that one. Yeah, that's coming back to me.
And that one stays in my mind because you think of like what type of, I mean, I don't want to be too disparaging, but you think of what kind of person is more accommodating to those guys. And maybe it's the strategic players who are on their way to becoming the most powerful lesbian in America. Like if you have that kind of drive, then you might have an instinctive knowledge that you should be nice to these guys. It's going to help your career.
That's an interesting point because what I knew about Anise Parker, my impression of her is that she actually sort of had a reputation for being kind of a moderate Democrat, because I mean, she was in Houston, which is a blue city, but not like, super liberal or anything. And that was sort of her reputation. But then it was sometime in her, when she was mayor, that there was some controversy about like that court that required that a school allow boys into the girls' locker room or something when they identified as girls. And then that derailed some ballot initiative about non-discrimination laws that involved sexual orientation. That was my impression of her. And so now hearing what you wrote about her backstory, it made me wonder, like, maybe a lot of these so-called moderate Democrats in purple and red areas, maybe they're not going to be the great big hope.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that for sure, because I think that being nice to perverted men is moderate.
That's true. I think it is. So in one of your essays, you talked about how it almost seemed like the trans stuff was going to die out, and then suddenly it took off again. You talk about kind of that dynamic.
That's so fascinating to me. I love like trans history, you know, it kind of goes into the dark ages in the 80s a little bit. So like I even in my mind have this mental map that's kind of like, you know, 1960s and 70s was antiquity, and everything was all kind of like classy, and there were the doctors and everything. And then it kind of sinks into the dark ages in the 80s, because around 1980, like, so these doctors have been doing sort of real science around this, like at least relative to today, where they're like genuinely trying to figure out if this is a good treatment and how the treatment should be administered and who benefits from it. And they're looking at objective measures of success for people. And in the 70s, these studies come back, and of course they say, well, this is not helping people flourish. The patients are not doing well. And so they realize this, they publish their studies, they talk about it, and it winds up getting a lot of the clinics shut down at universities. Not all of them, but it's definitely kind of goes into ill repute. And so then around 1980s, like, you're in a different position where there's not all these classy universities around the country talking to the media and schmoozing everyone and making this thing look good. It's moved out into private clinics. So these doctors who are kind of seedy and just making a lot of money off it. And this nonprofit, the Erickson Foundation, that was promoting this in the media, like that one kind of dies out. And so it really, transsexualism loses its luster. Some other factors around that time, of course, the AIDS epidemic. So you might have like some of the male transsexuals, of course, are being hit by that. The stories I found from that era are just kind of dark and gloomy about people being like, you know, men getting these injections off the street, and then like having like medical problems because of that. Like, it's all gross and sad in the 1980s. And the cross-dressing contingent, the transvestites, they've like kind of started creating these conferences in like weird locations where they just go out to motels, and it doesn't sound like they're really being political. They're just like jerking off together in pantyhose. And like that's so just to bring us really to the nadir there.
Yeah.
So things are, and then in the 1980s, what you also have is, remember, during that time with the hospitals, the doctors are vehemently denying that gender medicine is about sexuality and perversion. They're saying that those guys who have some kind of fetish driving it, like, they are not true transsexuals, and we can weed them out, and they're not real, don't pay attention to them. We're only serving true transsexuals. Again, because there are some studies being done, like, it becomes harder and harder to believe that. And you have some doctors like Ray Blanchard up in Toronto who just finds like, no, that true transsexual thing doesn't exist. Like, all these guys are either gay or they're perverts. Like, these are the two categories. And you can tell historically that the doctors like knew this way before, but were in denial. I don't know if it was conscious or unconscious denial.
The true transsexuals would have been the homosexuals then?
Well, so they would say there were three types of transsexuals, or no, not three. They would say there are three types of men who pursue genital surgery, is what they would have said. And one category was homosexuals, one was transvestites, word for perverts, and the third category was true transsexuals. There's no such thing as a true transsexual.
Yeah.
That was what they invented, and it had, if you try to analyze it, then you recognize like some features of gay men for sure, especially from that era. Like, oh, they were gender nonconforming as a child. They want to sleep with men. That's the true transsexual. But it was like a total fiction. It was just like this fantasy that the doctors had, that they could treat somebody who was like a good candidate for what they were giving out. And that falls apart in the 80s.
Okay, so the 80s are pretty gloomy, and a lot of the institutions aren't backing this as an actual treatment anymore. And then what happened?
The internet happened.
Ah,
yes.
It was even a problem then.
It is the root. It makes me so sad in hindsight, just thinking of like how exciting the internet was as a kid. But yeah, like, trans activism in the early 90s, like, just blows up. Kaboom. The first like event that you'd hear about would be 1991. Nancy Burkholder, a man, goes to Mishfest, the women's music festival, and it may be that men had done this before, but this is the one that has made history. So he goes there, they're hanging out at night, women clock him, they realize he's a man, they ask him to leave. The organizers put him up in a hotel for the night, ask him to leave because he's a man. And then he tells his trans friends, and again, like, the internet seems to be a part of this. Like, it spreads, all the trans identified men learn about this, and they start organizing. And by 1994, they have this big presence outside of Mishfest. Across the street from it, up in this wilderness area in Michigan, they're called Camp Trans. There's something like 13 trans-identified men, and 12 of them are lesbians, as they call themselves. And they also have female to males there supporting them as well. So these are women who identified as lesbians before, and now they are taking a testosterone.
Yeah, I was going to say, when Camp Trans came along, it did seem like there was a ton of women involved in Camp Trans.
Yeah,
was there more women than men, or was it pretty split?
I don't know the exact numbers, but there were definitely significant numbers of both.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a whole another topic that you've addressed, is how there were a lot of female to male, trans that were involved in a lot of the early, what you would call, TRA stuff. A lot of people make it sound like it was all the fetishy, men that were the bad guys, but there were definitely a lot of female to male that sort of infiltrated from the inside out.
Yes, exactly. So I tell the story as like an inside outside game where the women are inside, because the women they're all lesbians. I mean, I found one who identifies as a gay man from this entire 20th century, but in general, we seem to be talking about lesbians. There's rumors about other types nowadays, but the historical record is showing, as far as we know, tons of lesbians. So they are around and they are playing the inside game. They have access to these gay and lesbian groups because they are lesbians who have just like recently transitioned, and they are kind of trying to change things from the inside or use the institutions that have already been developed. And then they're in touch with, although they're not like doing the same thing as the males who are playing the outside game. And the males are, I think the activists are all the heterosexual type, as far as I can tell. Like the leaders of this 1990s movement, these are all cross-dressing men who call themselves lesbians. And they are attacking the institutions from the outside, saying like, you have to let us in, like you gay and lesbian groups are so bigoted against us, how dare you leave us behind. So they're lobbying a lot of criticisms from the outside, and then they're eventually forming their own organizations.
Wasn't there some kind of protest in the 90s from transsexuals against the New York Pride Parade?
Yeah, 1994 was the 25th anniversary of Stonewall, so it was a big deal. And leading up to that, this was well, in general, the trans-identified men and the women, I think, were adamant about adding the T to the gay and lesbian. So, and it was not LGB. It was called Gay and Lesbian or gay. I think the lesbians had just kind of made their stand and gotten everybody to acknowledge lesbians, and the trans were demanding inclusion. They're demanding that the T be added. And one of the big events where they staged that was around the planning for the Stonewall for the Pride Parade, which was a big deal because of the anniversary that year. So they were staging protests. They got into the New York Times. You can tell the reporters totally confused about everything. Some of my sources on this are from the men themselves, so who knows, but they report that they wound up being very successful in getting lesbians on their side at their rally. So I think, yeah, they might not have gotten T added at that point, but they really moved the ball forward in terms of getting recognition and being legitimized, and the media vaguely thinking they belong there, because they have this like huge argument, which they're bringing out, which is like, we have been left behind by the gays, like we are the same thing as the gays, and how dare they leave us behind, how dare they treat us this way. And it's like, what? You're just two different groups of people. Like, why do you feel entitled?
I could see how that's hard to argue, though, because there were homosexuals transitioning.
Right. So there's like that overlap.
So how do you can't, it's really hard to break that apart.
I mean, I would argue like they're not, I mean, the women who are transitioning were not calling themselves lesbians anymore. So, I mean, they were like angrily anti-lesbian and like making fun of lesbians. So I think it would be perfectly fine to argue for those women, like, well, you left.
Well, a few of the stories I have heard from lesbians that did transition in the 80s and 90s was that it was very much a case of, if you transitioned, you were kicked out of the lesbian community. Like, you were not even, for the most part, accepted in it. They were like, well, you want to be a man now, goodbye.
Yeah, I mean, and that's interesting. I don't know. And there is a lot more resistance or friction with the lesbians versus the gay men, which is interesting. Like, I just haven't run into gay men being part of the fight, but yes, lesbians were definitely on both sides of it.
Well,
But
I guess just to draw guess I should stipulate that the women who told me that were in lesbian groups that were more radical feminist lesbians. So I think that might be the difference. Maybe the more, just non-feminist lesbians out there, maybe they were more accepting of it, but the radical feminist groups were definitely like, no.
yeah, and I don't know. I mean, I guess you could look at it different ways, but it's consistent. I mean, it's not like anyone was tricked into thinking they could transition, and then after they did, they were surprised. Like, the radical feminists have been onto this since at least the 70s.
Interesting. I'm just curious, in your research, did you encounter any evidence that during like the 80s and the 90s, during the AIDS epidemic, that any evidence about the role that pharmaceutical companies played in gaining influence over the sort of gay and lesbian quote unquote rights organizations? Because that's one theory I sometimes hear, that the gay rights organizations became very strongly linked to pharmaceutical companies due to the AIDS epidemic, and that ended up playing a role in them also with the pharmaceutical drugs for transitioning.
Yeah, that's such a good question. I haven't done too much original research myself. Roisin Michaud, it does some of that, and it's really interesting if you want to check her out. Yeah, like, there was kind of an alliance formed. I think some of the organizations might have had like pharmaceuticals on their board, or like they're getting donations from pharma, and so these relationships are being formed in the 80s, and then they're still around later on, or kind of like these warm feelings that some people may have toward pharmaceuticals, where, again, if you go before the AIDS epidemic, like I said, gays were really turning on the medical establishment for good reason.
So do you know when the T was officially added?
Yeah, very quickly during the 1990s, and you could almost like narrow it to the mid 90s. So, you have those big angry protests that include Stonewall in 1994. And then there are these kind of conferences over the next several years. And just to lay out the scene, there are a number of gay and lesbian organizations, especially around legal advocacy. So, for example, a human rights campaign, or National Gay and Lesbian Task Force, and National Center for Lesbian Rights. So, there's this handful of organizations that you could possibly target. And in fact, the trans people did target them. And it was just quickly, it didn't seem to be, there didn't seem to be that much tension about it, which is really interesting. Also, I haven't gotten to the bottom of this, but the B came along with the T. And there's even like a conference at some point in the mid 90s where they apparently there was like a bisexual caucus and a transsexual or a transgender caucus. And they just like connected and said, like, we're going to work together on this. We're going to be at the same time. And it was successful, obviously.
Oh,
and
that's,
then,
that's interesting.
yeah, they were, and they didn't initially settle on LGBT. Like, for a while, they published this in their newsletters and everything. They were like, we are going to be the lesbigators. And in parentheses, it's like, sounds like alligator. And
it
so
does.
it
Does sound like alligator.
Yes. And I kind of wish they had. I don't know why that failed. I mean, it's clearly better than LGBT, like lesbigator. Yeah, so I got to find out more.
Would you say that it got, now, did it seem to work its way in more through the law side of it first? Because
Well,
you're just talking about how, like, human rights and these kind of organizations were already starting to like get pressured and do the work. And I think you also wrote about something that I think it was the Human Rights Campaign, maybe, or maybe a different one that would, like, in 2007 was already doing like some interesting court cases involving trans, quote unquote, trans rights.
Oh, absolutely. And the court cases, they started in the 90s, actually. And yeah, so just to do the timeline, I think some of the biggest organizations for gay and lesbian people were legal organizations. So like they were targets. Lambda Legal, I think I left them out. The ACLU had a gay and lesbian project. And ACLU was not the Leviathan that it is today, but it was still pretty big and important. So they're just sitting there, they're sitting ducks, and these guys who come up, these cross-dressers in the 90s, several of them are lawyers. So they have that angle that they're interested anyway. So that's Phyllis Fry, who I mentioned, down in Texas, friends with Denise Parker. He organizes the ICTLEP conference, because these guys are really good at naming things. It's like International Conference, Transgender Law, whatever. And he brings lawyers together, including Martine Rothblatt, if you know that name. So Martine Rothblatt now is known as like this scary transhumanist guru guy, but he was a lawyer. He was in healthcare regulation or something at that point. He's wealthy, and he is joining forces with these other wealthy cross-dressers. He's got this legal background, and he's thinking about how to influence the law back from like early 90s.
Would it be fair to say that the bulk of the money came from these types of guys?
Likely. I mean, I haven't totally traced the money thing, but for sure, like you have all these guys who they're at least making good incomes. And that's kind of the stereotype about cross-dressers for sure, is that they're wealthy white men, wealthy white straight men. Ricky Wilchins is a big activist here. And so at this point, he's in New York City, and he's working on Wall Street, and he's running like a tech consultancy, which I imagine during that era, that must have been blowing up financially. So, and you compare that to the gay rights movement, where they're struggling. Like obviously a lot of the men have AIDS. The lesbians never had any money. So this is what bugs me too about the historical narrative that people kind of give off the cuff nowadays, which is like they treat gays and lesbians as though they were this like juggernaut all along, and like, oh, just wealthy, successful, like a lot of them could pass as straight, whatever. And then trans was scrappy little brother. Bullshit. That is a narrative that was pushed by Ricky Wilchins and Phyllis Fry, these very wealthy straight white men in the 90s who just co-opted the stories of Black and Latino men who would cross-dress. They may have been prostitutes. They had very difficult lives, like Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. Their stories were just totally co-opted by the rich white men to make the trans movement look a lot scrappier than it actually was. And so in the 90s, like there's some documentation that it looked like the Gay and Lesbian Center of New York City was hitting up the cross-dressers of New York City for funds, like writing them letters like, oh, thank you so much for donating, like let's work together on this.
That's fascinating to me about that particular money angle. You've mentioned before, and maybe this was on your Twitter X, that the motive, that there might have been a lucrative motive for why the gay rights organizations turned to gay marriage. Like it wasn't necessarily like that was where they I forgot the exact way you worded it, but it was in your critique of the idea that the gay rights groups only pivoted after gay marriage.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just not true because they'd all pivoted before gay marriage. Like gay marriage came out really fast. And I mean, it percolated in the 90s. There were some cases, but early 2000s, it's not just that they won for the first time, but it suddenly becomes super popular, and they're getting donations, and they're making all these corporate alliances with big law firms and also, big American institutions. So, but at that time, they were already allied with the trans people, and even now, like there's some whining, complaining, like, oh, the trans people were forced to work for gay marriage. Like Chase Strangio has said that. And it's like, oh, come on, you were making money off of gay marriage. Like your movement got so rich because of gay marriage.
Yeah, that was the question I was going for, was the money that was coming in, that like these, like you said before, the gay groups were not actually very wealthy, or the gays themselves weren't wealthy, but the gay marriage brought a huge money influx. Wow.
I kind of marvel at the timing of the trans groups, where it's like they start attacking the gays in the 90s and they get added, and like, sure, that's a boost, but I don't think they could have foreseen how much of a boost it would be, like how popular and lucrative gay marriage would become just 10 years later. But anyway, they did, and they were in place, and they were situated to inherit all of the prestige and the assets in 2015.
So how do you view the idea that this is all basically a corporate money scheme and it comes from the top?
I mean, I'm generally skeptical of big sweeping theories that locate just like, one cause. I mean, I definitely think there's some conspiratorial angle here. Like these are rich guys who wanted something and they got it done. And clearly just when you look at the speed of how quickly this has grown, on top of like how it's totally irrational and yet everyone believes it, I mean, you have to imagine there's something nefarious going on and that it's somewhat organized. But at the same time, I think there are multiple things going on, and maybe a confluence of bad things and bad luck coming together.
To me, it almost seems like it's a human belief system that came about, and then it kind of caught on, and then some rich dudes got involved and boosted it up. But the belief system was already there way before the money came in.
Right, yeah. And it depends how you define money, I guess. Like the gender doctors of the 1960s and 70s were making their careers a little bit, but they weren't becoming billionaires. They were just like upper middle class doctors with an interesting career.
Well, when I say money, I mean like, Rothblatt money,
money.
Yeah. Like that kind of money, I guess.
Yeah, and even Rothblatt himself, like he wasn't the ultra billionaire he is today. Like back when he started, he was just like a regular upper middle class guy, I think. So yeah, the right, everything is kind of, I view this like visually as like this spiral thing, where if you go back 100 years, it's just like an idea. Like there's like the Dutch girl who's like this autogynephile guy talking to a doctor, being like, oh yeah, that sounds really sexy to get my dick chopped off. And it's like kind of like a small thing, just like a few weird doctors and a few weird guys in Northern Europe who like to cross dress. Then it grows a little bit bigger, like they get a little bit of press, which brings in more people who are curious, some gay people who are confused and having a difficult time. They start following along, and then more media picks up. It becomes a little more institutionalized in universities, and you see this like kind of spiraling outward. It gets bigger and bigger, the number of people and the number of institutions that are involved in it. But it is it's not overnight, and it's not one particular like guy behind a curtain. I think it is organic,
So then, in terms of the legal aspect to it, what were some of like the very early legal victories for the trans activists, either in terms of a court decision or something being snuck into the law?
So they had some minor victories in terms of like in the 1970s, they get a local ordinance passed in Minneapolis, which says like you can't discriminate against people based on, it doesn't say gender identity. It's basically like if you look like the opposite sex. So, they get that passed into law, and there's a few little things like that, but I don't think they changed the course of the movement. The big legal victories really start in the 2000s. That's when they really, and before then also there's some individual wins, like for example, Renee Richards, a male tennis player who wants to play women's tennis. Like he wins in this a court case in New York, but it doesn't get appealed. So it doesn't really bind the rest of the country, but it's just like this curiosity of like, wow, this guy really, he won his lawsuit and got to play women's tennis. And there's like some family law cases where they have some success, but really it takes a while for them to start winning the legal victories. And it does just happen to coincide with when they get institutional support from big nonprofits that were set up to help gays and lesbians. So before then, it's not really clear to me who their lawyers were and whether there's like a coordinated strategy, but in the 2000s, they've got really well-placed lawyers at the ACLU and Lambda who are all working together and who are hammering on this strategy. And I think that story has still not been told, in terms of like the lawyers have always tried to make it look as though the doctors are driving this and like their expert witnesses are giving them the ideas and they're just putting on the case. That's doubtful. And in my opinion, it looks like the lawyers were really involved in shaping the theory of transgenderism, starting in, I mean, if you count Martine Rothblatt and Phyllis Frye, then of course in 1990s they were shaping it. But then if you're looking at the institutional actors like the ACLU, is the 2000s.
And do you know like kind of specifically what case or cases the 2000s brought that were kind of shifted things?
Yeah, so there's some cases, it depends on how you're counting what's powerful. So there's some cases where they're like actually getting rights under employment law. And this is stuff that actually we might agree with in terms of what they're winning, because they're just, they're getting these rulings that say you can't be discriminated against for violating sex stereotypes. So it's like, yeah, cool. Like it's the same idea as like a woman with short hair should not be fired, like a woman with a beard should not be fired. Yeah, absolutely. So like they're getting these victories, which are basically good as long as the language, I mean, it depends on the reasoning of the decision, but basically cool. Like, yeah, we don't want anyone being discriminated against on that basis either. But there's also some interesting victories just in the fact that they're filing the cases at all. Like, so for example, in 2000, the organization that, we're going to Boston now. So Boston is where we had the first big gay marriage victory in 2003. very famous. The organization that brought that was GLAAD, which is not to be confused with GLAAD, unfortunately. It's GLAAD with one A. It's a legal organization, Gay and Lesbian Advocates and Defenders. Of course, now it's GLBTQ Advocates and Defenders nowadays. But so GLAAD brings that case, and they win in 2003. And it's like Mary Bonato is the lawyer, and so it looks like, wow, this is a great gay and lesbian organization. That same org, before they even filed the lawsuit in Massachusetts that would bring gay marriage, they filed a lawsuit in 2000 in Massachusetts on behalf of a boy who was only 12 years old and wanted to dress like a girl at school. And he was being socially transitioned. So that's an example of GLAAD. And this, they did win, but it kind of stayed within Massachusetts. It's not like a national precedent or anything, but it definitely signaled to everybody, like, we should be taking these lawsuits. We can take these lawsuits. And it's just like this interesting signal. And it also brings on perhaps more funding, because the early 2000s is when you really see this is entrenched. All the funders at places like the Ford Foundation are liking the trans stuff. They want to fund it. And so I view that case as kind of a momentum builder. And it's also so fascinating to me, since GLAAD was winning that gay marriage lawsuit, but even before then was winning these trans kid lawsuits that we would associate with like the 2020s. And so it's a good example to show somebody who thinks that all this started in 2015. That's just not true.
Wow, I didn't even know that. I didn't know that was a kid case already. I mean, it's just like transitioning kids. It was happening way, way before most people think it was.
Exactly. Everything goes back further than you think. It's so fascinating. And I wish I knew more about that case. Like, I've tried, but because of the location, that was in Brockton, Massachusetts, which is a working class suburb of Boston. And Boston had Boston's Children's Hospital, which became the epicenter, the first child gender clinic. But even before then, the hospital that was attached to their endocrinology department was seeing children, or no, the way I've seen this written is people of various pubertal stages. That would be children.
Okay.
In the endocrinology department, and that was starting in 1998. 1998 was the same year that WPATH printed in their SOC that like a section on puberty blockers. So apparently that was seen as a green light. If you connect the dots, it seems like places like Boston, the hospital there they might have been transitioning kids all the way back then with puberty blockers, and we just did not know about it. And then, so that's when you see that kid in Brockton filing his lawsuit. Like, that might not be a coincidence. Like, it doesn't say in the papers, but maybe that person was being treated with puberty blockers. Maybe they were working with this Boston clinic.
That's fascinating stuff.
Yeah.
I forget the name of that. Is that doctor that did the TED Talk?
Norman Spack. Yeah.
Was he the one who headed that up in Chicago?
In Boston?
Oh, Boston, sorry.
So I don't know for certain, but it matches up. He was there. He was in that same hospital. He's an endocrinologist. He was doing some trans stuff, so it probably was him.
Yeah.
Do you know of any story about the history behind the suicide myth? Because one thing that I've heard is that originally the whole like suicide thing was something that started with like gay kids, that we should be more supportive for gay kids in schools because they'd commit suicide, and how that ended up being kind of a Trojan horse for a lot of the if you don't transition kids, then they'll commit suicide. And some of this, I've heard about this in California. I don't know if you've encountered any of that with your research.
Not really research. It does not surprise me. I've definitely suspected that they steal everything from gay people. So for sure they would jump on that. And we all remember that there have been like real legitimate gay campaigns that like it gets better or so yeah, that's not a surprising idea. And also just in general in the 90s, Ricky Wilchins led this movement. It was mostly focused on hate crimes, but it was generally so dark and gory, constantly hammering home the idea that trans people live in like this really dark place and they're victims of all kinds of violence. And there's just constant negativity out of Ricky Wilchins. And so I think that is the era where you might see that they're focusing on just anything really negative and scary they can say about people, trans people.
So this tugging at the heartstrings, this has been going on for decades.
Oh yeah.
And especially in the gay community and gay and lesbian community, right? Since they were infiltrating there first, they were already trying to guilt trip everybody into thinking they were the
Oh,
biggest victims.
oh, for sure. In the 90s, that's what they were constantly haranguing the gays about, was that like you're leaving behind the most vulnerable members. They also had a definition of transgender, which is different from what we use today. So back then, these geniuses came up with the idea that anybody who's gender nonconforming is transgender. And that was a great political move because it includes more people. So if you say the only people who are transgender are those who want to get genital surgery, that's a narrow pool. But if you say anybody who's gender nonconforming is transgender, much broader.
So that too started much further back.
Yes.
People also think that the legit medical trans people came along, and then it was the expand the umbrella, but it was already expanded.
In the 90s, yeah, very, very abruptly. So even before the 90s, the cross-dressers were using the word transgender to, they wanted their own label because they didn't want to get genital surgery, but they did want to use estrogen because, we don't yet. So they were like kind of scrounging around for new labels for themselves. So instead of transsexual, they would say, oh, we're transgenderist or something like that. But then for political purposes, that was Ricky Wilchins in the 90s. He has this insight that we need to have a big tent, and we need to, because when you say that gender nonconforming counts, and that includes, of course, a lot of gay people. So that's how they draw the connection, that gay people, and then they would yell and scream that any gay person who resisted what they had to say, including, lesbians who didn't want to sleep with them, all these gay people, the reason they resisted was because they were privileged, and they were probably white, and they were passed as straight, and that's why they didn't care about their brothers and sisters who were quote unquote transgender.
Yeah, but see, we hear that this is only a new thing that the trans rights advocates do. They didn't do it back then. They were all good back then.
Oh wow, really? Is that the...
I mean, that's the take I tend to get from the gender criticals movement, is that the real transsexuals that existed back then were very polite and nice and respectful and didn't do any of these kind of stuff, and it's just this modern day crackpot transgender folks that are saying these crazy things.
Hey, I mean, I'm sure there were some nice transsexuals, and for some elder members, they might have genuinely had friends back then who were cool transsexuals who were not trying to hijack the gay rights movement. But the leaders, the people who mattered historically, they were gigantic flaming assholes. They were at least as aggressive as any of the whiny people we deal with today. I mean, they seem honestly kind of worse.
Yeah, they were using the same scheme was happening then and it's happening now.
Yeah, what's funny about reading those old documents is that sometimes even the way they talk reminds me of 2010s far left. So they'll do a lot of howdy y'all folks kind of stuff, fake folksy, even though you look at where they're from and it's San Francisco, New York. So all that, I had associated it with, maybe 10 years ago, but not 1990s.
And I'm also curious too, what are the first cases that you know of sex changes being acknowledged legally?
Oh, that's early. Man, they were fast out of the gate. So 1966 is when Johns Hopkins opens the country's first gender clinic. There might have been some surgeries before then, it's a little murky. But 1966 is on the map, and the gender doctors just get to work right away, influencing courts and kind of bureaucrats who can change birth certificates. So in the 1960s, I saw some study where generally everybody in the 1960s, meaning lawyers, judges, people with power, were saying no, this is just cosmetic surgery, it's not changing people's sex, goodbye. And then the 1970s, big sea change. A lot of the judges, even when they're not ruling the transsexuals' favor for some technical reason, they're super sympathetic, and they're very open to the idea that men are women. So this was very coordinated, and it had to do with these these doctors who were affiliated with fancy universities throughout the country, throwing around their influence, and they're backed by the Erickson Foundation.
I've heard the argument made that some of the legal sex changes were acknowledged to make marriage easier for some people. If they wanted to get a same-sex marriage, what was technically a same-sex marriage, which was illegal, they could claim to be if they were the opposite sex legally, they could do it.
Yeah, for sure. There were some legal cases in the 1970s about that, and some legislatures also changed their laws, and that might have been part of the debate, but I'm not really as closely attuned to that. But for sure, there are lawsuits where they're discussing whether or not a marriage is valid, and gets to the question of like, well, is this person a man or a woman? And so then they're analyzing that.
So why do you think that people have the idea that this stuff just blew up after gay marriage? It does seem to be definitely going mainstream after gay marriage, maybe.
Yeah, I think people didn't notice it, or they forgot about it, what happened before. And I also think people just like to come up with theories, even though they haven't researched it as deeply as one might want to. So I think yeah, I don't want to criticize people too much, because it is an important insight that things changed after 2015 for sure.
Yeah, I'm just thinking, I mean, I saw it much earlier. A lot of us did see it much earlier, but it does seem that it really, you know what, I think that the media really started pushing it. Maybe that's where it switches.
But even there, the media was very pro-transsexual in the 1970s. Actually, I have a story from '69 where they were very supportive.
Wait, the media was even all over it in the 50s, right? With
Oh, Christine Jorgensen, that's correct. Yeah, all the tabloids are super into the blonde bombshell. Yeah. So I mean, I think to give a more fun answer to your question, I think there are actors in our space who have a little bit of an agenda in saying like things used to be great and now they're bad, because there's some individuals, especially if they work in the gender space, if they've trans people themselves, if they are themselves transgender, then they might have an interest in rolling back the clock 10 years, but not getting rid of all this stuff entirely. So of course it suits their needs if people believe that this is a fundamentally decent movement that quote unquote went off the rails.
Yeah, and that doesn't seem to necessarily be the case. It seems to have always been a bit of a problem.
I mean, I'd also throw into that, there are some conservatives, some social conservatives who also kind of buy into that narrative because they don't like gay marriage and they want to say that they're vindicated with the slippery slope argument that, of course, gay marriage legalized and then all this, you know, everything was hell in a handbasket afterwards. We were right the whole time. So that's another reason why some people, though not all people, would endorse it.
Yeah, absolutely.
But as Unyielding Bicyclist has pointed out, there's also conservatives that support trans stuff too. Like this isn't necessarily just one group or the other. I've said this before. We all took part in this in some way. You know, we all have to look at where it came from and see where, you know, learn from history.
Yeah. I really hope people get more into history because it's so fascinating. And yeah, people have to like why I look into history, and it's just like once you do, then you know. Like then you realize you had all the assumptions that you never even were conscious of before you looked back in time and see this other perspective.
And you can't really fight it. You can't really argue with it unless you know the history, unless you know what you're dealing with. And I think that's why it's so important. And that's why we wanted you to come on and talk about this. And I really want people to go read your stuff, because it's just like, if you understand the history, you're just so much more able to fight back against this.
Exactly.
Yeah, and on that note, we are approaching the hour mark. I just wanted to say thank you for coming, Unyielding Bicyclist. Is there any last things you want to say?
Just keep watching LGBT Alliance. All the news comes through LGBT Alliance. Go for it.
Thank you.
And of course, we can find you on your Substack, badfacts.substack.com, and you also have a Twitter. We'll put the links in the comment section. So yeah, with that, thank you so much for coming, and we hope to see our audience again for our next video, and thank you for joining us.
All right, thank you guys. We'll